basically, um, there's a word right now that's used to describe what Trumpism is becoming. Basically, Trump said he became worse. He was already worse before the. Um, basically, Trump said he became worse. He was already worse before what he's talking about. That's how double impeachment changed him. Donald Trump took a audience and told a conservatard audience in Dallas last weekend without a trace of a fucking smile. This was not the Trump. This was not Trump, the insult person talking. This was the deepest Trump. This was the deepest Trump self, and this time was the only time he ever told the truth because he's talking about how horrible he is in person. Something has changed for Trump and his movement since January of 2021. You can measure the difference by looking back at the deadly events in Charlottesville, Virginia back in 2017, and Trump made three statements about those events over the last 4 days. He was visibly reluctant to speak negatively of the far right groups. He praised fine people on both sides and spread the blame for this egregious display of hatred, bigotry, and violence on many sides. Um, Trump's evasions triggered a national uproar as Joe Biden complained in an essay for The Atlantic at the time. Um, today, he says today, back at this time, he said today we have an American president who has publicly proclaimed a moral equivalency between neo-Nazis and Klansmen and those who would oppose their venom and hate. But if Trump refused to single out the far right groups for criticism, he also refrained from praising them. But whatever he felt in his heart, he was constrained by certain political and practical realities. His non-Twitter actions as squatter were filtered through bureaucracies. He had to work with repug congressional allies who were worried about losing their seats in Congress in the next election. But he himself was still basking in the illusion of his supposedly huge victory in 2016 and hoping for a repeat in 2020, but outright endorsement of lethal extremism. That was too much for Trump in 2017, but now look where we are now. In the first days after the January 6th Capitol in the first days after the January 6th insurrection attack on the Capitol, Trump sycophants distanced themselves from its success. Um, the attack had nothing to do with Trump, but they argued he had urged only a peaceful demonstration. Yeah, bullshit. If anybody did any harm, that person was a concealed agent of Antifa, which isn't really a group at all. But in the months since, the mood has shifted. Once repudiated, the texts are now accepted, condoned, and even endorsed. In the past few days, leading pro-Trump figures and even non-Trump conservatard figures have endorsed a startling Twitter thread by a previously boutique podcaster, Daryl Cooper, and fucker Carlson had read the thread aloud on his show. The thread argued that the January 6th protesters were right to believe that they had been cheated out of power they deserved. They don't deserve the power. They were right to believe that the government and the law were conspiring against them, which they weren't. They were right to believe that their opponents were capable of anything, even assassinating Trump, which who knows how many want that to happen. The implication, they themselves were equally entitled to go just as far, and it's long, but I'll quote two key passages. The entrenched bureaucracy and security state subverted Trump from day one. B, the press is part of the operation. C, election rules were changed. D, big tech centers opposition, and political violence is legitimized and encouraged. And F, if Trump is banned from social media. They were led down some rabbit holes, but they are absolutely right that the government is monopolized by a regime that believes they are beneath representation and will observe no limits to keep them getting it. Trump sycophants should be happy he lost. It might have kept him alive. The tweet thread began by claiming that Donald Trump himself shared these beliefs, but one might wonder how the podcaster would know. The answer arrived on Sunday morning when Trump phoned into that media whore, Maria Bartiromo's, she's a dumb cunt anyway, phone news show to deliver his most full-throated endorsement yet of the January 6th attack on Congress. The ex-squatter had praised Ashley Babbitt. That was her own fault she died. The woman that was killed as she attempted to crash through the door that protected members of Congress from the mob that had invaded the Capitol. She was not innocent, she was not wonderful, and the woman was a fucking delusional bitch. He had praised the insurrectionists wrong, calling them great people, which they weren't. He denounced their arrest and jailing as unjust, and he implied that Babbitt had been shot by the personal security detail of a leading member of Congress. He also said, I've heard also that it was the head of security for a certain high official, a Democrat. It's going to come out, no, it's not. The relentless messaging by Trump and his sycophants has inflicted a measurable wound on American democracy. Before the 2020 election, about 60% of Democrats and Repugs had expected the election to be fair. But since Trump began circulating his ever more radical delusions, the Repug confidence in the election has tumbled by half to barely more than 30%, according to a polling supported by the Democracy Fund. The Trump movement was always authoritarian and, and, and delusional. It indulged periodically in the rhetoric of violence Trump himself shaped against the restraints of law, but what the United States did not have before 2020 was a large national movement willing to justify mob violence to claim political power, but now it does. Is there a precedent to this? But not in recent years. Since the era of redemption after construction, anti-government violence in the United States has been the work of marginal sections and individual extremists. American Islamic State supporters were never going to seize the state, and neither were the Weather Underground, the Ku Klux Klan killers of the 1950s and 60s, Puerto Rican nationalists, the German American Bund, nor the Communist Party. But the post-election Trump movement is not tiny. It's not anything. It's like a national majority. But it's a majority in some states, a plurality in some, and everywhere a significant minority empowered by the inability of pro-legality repugs to stand up to them. Once it might have been hoped that young Republicans of the future would somehow distance themselves from the violent lawlessness of the post-squatteral Trump movement, but one by one they are betting the other way. You might understand why those tainted by the January 6 attacks, such as the senator, the dumbass Josh Hawley of Missouri, would find excuses for him. They have their asses to cover, but Hawley is being outdone by other young politicians who weren't in office and seem to have every opportunity to build a post-Trump identity, including even former Trump critics like the Ohio Senate aspirant Jay Vance. But why do people sign up with the dumbasses after that person has failed, and they're betting that the failed person is not the past, it's the future? What shall we call this future? Through the Trump years, it seems sensible to eschew comparisons to the worst passages of history. People have repeated over and over again a warning against too easy use of the F word, and what we're talking about is not fuck, it's fascism. There are a lot of stops on the train line, too bad before you get to Hitler Station. Two traits have historically marked off European-style fascism from more homegrown American traditions of the illiberalism, contempt for legality, and the cult of violence. The squatteral-era Trumpism operated through at least the forms of law. The squatteral-era Trumpism glorified military power, not mob attacks on government institutions. The post-squattancy, those past inhibitions, are fast dissolving. The conversion of Ashley Babbitt into a martyr, a sort of American horse whistle, expresses the transformation. Through 2020, Trump had endorsed deadly force against lawbreakers. When the looting started, the shooting starts. He tweeted on May 29, 2020, Babbitt broke the law too, but not to steal a TV. She was killed as she tried to disrupt the constitutional order to prevent the formalization of the result of a democratic election. If a big enough movement agrees with Trump that Babbitt was wonderful, which she wasn't, if they repeat that the crowd of would-be Nancy Pelosi kidnappers and Mike Pence lynchers are great, then we are leaving behind the American system of a democratic political competition for a new landscape in which power is determined by the gun, and that's a landscape for which a lot of pro-Trump writers and thinkers seem to yearn. You are living in territory controlled by enemy tribes. You and all the people like you that think stupidly. They must assume the innocence of anyone remotely like yourself who is charged in any confrontation with those tribes and with their authorities. Until proven otherwise beyond the shadow of your doubt, take his side, which I won't. In other words, you must shield others like yourself by practicing and urging what they call jury nullification. And those words are not taken from the Turner Diaries or some other Aryan Nation tract. They were published by a leading pro-Trump site, which is pathetic. The same site where Trump's former in-house intellectual, Michael Anton, publishes. They were written by somebody named Angelo Codevilla, who wrote the books and articles that defined so much of the Trump creed in 2016. Codevilla's 2016 book, The Ruling Class, was introduced by Rush Limp Dick and heavily promoted on Limp Dick's radio program. We are so accustomed to using the word fascist as an epithet that it feels awkward to adjust it for political analysts. We understand that there were and are many varieties of socialism. We forget that there were varieties of fascism as well, and not just those defeated in World War II. Um, Peronism in Argentina offers a lot of insights into the post-squadral Trumpism. Ron Perón, um, a bungling and um, imbecility leader, attracted followers with a jumble of often conflict of with a jumble of often conflicting and contradictory ideas. He had the good luck to take power in a major producing nation at that time, when the world was fucking hungry, and imagine that the brief flash of easy prosperity that followed was his own doing. The only thing he knew for certain was the target of his hatred. Anybody who got in his way, anybody who questioned him, anybody who fought for himself or herself, an expatriate Argentine who grew up under Perón's rule remembered the graffiti on the walls and the Twitter of its day. Build the fatherland, kill the student, as U.S. Napole astutely observed. Even when the money ran out, Peronism could offer hate as hope. After Perón lost power, Peronism became a myth of what they call the lost golden age, a fantasy of restoration and redemption, and always a rejection of the frustrations of normal politics, of the tedium of legality. And who needed policies when the solution to every problem was a magic name? Politicians who hoped for the world leader's blessing trudged to his place of exile, where they photographed with him and then sabotaged him. The only plan he allowed was somehow to force himself again upon his country one way or another. It was pathetic and terrifying, a national catastrophe that produced a long-running international musical. In the United States, the forces of legality still mobilize more strength than their Trumpist adversaries, but those who uphold the American constitutional order needed to understand what they were facing. Trump incited his followers to try to thwart an election attack and to kill or threaten Trump's own vice president if he would not or could not deliver on Trump's crazy scheme to keep his power. We're past the point of pretending that it was Antifa that did January 6th, that did January 6th, and past the point of pretending that Trump didn't want what he fomented and what he got. In his interview on July 11th, as the ever more explicit talk of his sycophants, the new line about the attack on the Capitol is guilty but justified. The election of 2020 was a fraud, and so those who lost it are entitled to overturn it. I do not consider myself guilty, but I admit all the factual aspects of the charge. I cannot plead that I am guilty of high treason, for there can be no high treason against that treason committed back in 1918. Maybe you recognize those words. They came from Adolf Hitler's plea of self-defense at his trial for his 1923 Munich attack. He argued, "You are not entitled to the power you hold, so I committed no crime and I tried to grab it back. You blame me for what I did, I blame you for who you are." But Trump is no Hitler, obviously, but they share some ways of thinking. The past never repeats itself, but it offers warnings. It's time to start using the F word again, fascism, but not to defame, but to diagnose. So if you like the video, give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, Rambin Mike, and also hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when a new video comes out, and thank you for listening.